the Executive Director here at Jones Memorial Library. It is a pleasure to have you with us. This is the last in the series of lectures for this year in the John D. Owen Jr. Lecture Series. We are already planning next year's series, and we have 4 things already on the docket for next year. Next year, we're also going to be offering some exhibits here in the space, and we'll be starting with our first exhibit and opening on June 21st of the Faber collection. So Everett and Ivo Faber are architects of local and national renown, and we will be exhibiting plans and models and things from their collection here, and that exhibit will open June 21st with the reception at 4 p.m. And then that exhibit will be here until August 31st. We'll have 2 other exhibits next year, so keep an eye out for that. If you don't get our monthly e-newsletters, you have an email, feel free to sign up in the lobby. We have our register, and we will add your email to our list so that you can get regular notifications of our events. For next year, I'd like you to put on your calendars, if you can make a mental note, September 20th will be the first in our lecture series next year. Next year's lectures will start at 5:30 p.m. That'll give folks who are working a little bit extra time to get here. So we'll be moving from a 5 p.m. start to 5:30 next year. So September 20th, we will have Jelaine Lewis. She is the Executive Director of the Pierce Street Gateway, and she's going to give us an update on some of the buildings there and the wonderful things that they're doing with that project. So that's September 20th, 5:30. But it is my pleasure now to ask Champ Mike, who is President of the Board of Trustees, to come up and introduce Sue Ellen Inman.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you, Deb. And a disclaimer, I'm a member of St. Paul's Church, so if I'm prejudiced on this subject, it comes honestly. And we've got a number of members of the congregation here present. I'm not going to name them all because there's too many of them probably to name, but I will say that we're competing against the Wednesday evening worship service. So I don't know whether they get brownie points for being here or negative points for not being in the worship service, but we're happy to have you here. So just a short bio background on Sue Ellen. She was born in Richmond and spent the next 13 years moving between Upper South Carolina and the Low Country with her parents and 2 siblings. After college in Charleston, South Carolina, events took her to live in South Korea and Germany, with a few moves in between, while raising a son and daughter. She has a grandson that is nearby, which makes her very happy. Sue Ellen's husband and she were living in California, where he worked for Lockheed Martin, and she was pursuing a career in retail training management. And they retired in 2011 and relocated to Lynchburg, which was home to my parents and grandparents. Moving to Lynchburg brought me back to St. Paul's, the church of my baptism and my parents' marriage. Several activities keep me busy at St. Paul's, mainly on the Altar Guild and working with the archives. Needlework, genealogy research, and gardening were favorites of mine. It was while organizing St. Paul's archives that the idea for the book on the 200th history of St. Paul's came up. And we really, the congregation, it's a marvelous book if you haven't seen it. She has copies of it for sale here. It's really just a work of art, and I mean that with all objectivity. If you compare it to a lot of other church history books, it's much more engaging, quite candidly. And part of that is the manner in which Sue Ellen wrote the book. The voice that she wrote it in is engaging to draw you into the book. And then we have who I call the creative genius of Lynchburg or Central Virginia, Nancy Marion, do all the layouts and sort through the photographs. And then to top it off, we have Nina Salmon, who many of you all know, to edit the book. So we really had 3 of the superstars to work on this book. And if you haven't seen it, I think if you will take a look at it after her lecture, I think you'll want to have a copy of it. But it's great to have you here. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Sue Ellen. Sue Ellen?
Good evening. Make sure you can hear me. Okay. Thank you for attending this lecture on the history of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and thank you to our hosts at Jones Memorial Library for keeping history alive and thriving in Lynchburg. St. Paul's has a 200-year history as an urban church in Lynchburg, Virginia, encompassing 3 churches of the same name. St. Paul's is so fortunate to have vestry books dating back to the founding of the first church for historical reference. Reading the books in their beautiful faded script brings home the fact that these were real people living very different times from ours. A little background will be helpful to understand how St. Paul's came to be. Lynch's Ferry was a small village on the banks of the James River, and John Lynch donated 45 acres of land in 1786 to establish the town of Lynchburg. This is a plan of the town of Lynchburg surveyed by John Stick in 1790. And by looking at the map and accounting for street name changes, the first St. Paul's, built in 1826, would have occupied lot 53. There's my pointer. There it is,
Upper right-hand corner, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's 7th and Church and 7th, right there. And then okay. This map is not dated, but the artist incorporated sketches of buildings spanning 100 years. The map key indicates the lot number and building names. This beautifully drawn map is owned by Lynchburg City Museum. Pre-Revolutionary Virginia was an English colony, and the only religion sanctioned was that of the Church of England, most commonly known as Anglican. An Anglican church was established in 1765 by Judge Edmund Winston, a devout Anglican and prominent citizen of Lynch's Ferry. This sketch of the church is based on descriptions of the church lot and graveyard taken from historical documentation. The church and graveyard were located where modern-day 10th, 11th, Court, and Clay streets are. If you drive down Court, you can see the city blocks where the boundaries of the church and graveyard were. At the time, the graveyard was the only burial ground for Lynchburg's dead. Due to the conflict of the American Revolution, the church was abandoned, but the graveyard continued to house the remains of Lynchburg citizens until the Methodist Cemetery was opened in 1806. This grave marker is that of John Brown, who died in 1801 and was interred in the Anglican graveyard. When the Methodist Cemetery was opened, some effort was made to relocate the remains of those buried in the Anglican graveyard when John Lynch sold the former lot in 1812. However, when ground was broken to build a home on the lot, many bones were found on the property, indicating that removal to the Methodist Cemetery wasn't highly successful. Historical records show that John Brown's grave marker was still in the graveyard as of 1814 and was moved to the Methodist Cemetery sometime after that. Whether his actual remains were able to be removed is unknown because they didn't have vaults for graves back then, so they just went into the ground, and those are the ones that were found when the house was built. Other graves were probably moved, but the old city cemetery records show John Brown's gravestone is the only one to have come from the Anglican graveyard. As of the early 1800s, the Methodists and Baptists had established churches in Lynchburg, but there was no Episcopalian presence. Lingering resentment towards the Church of England and the aftermath of the Revolution played a role in the lack of Episcopalian presence and a place to worship. There were certainly Episcopalians who wanted to worship together, and when the Methodists opened their meeting house to all denominations, the first Episcopal service was held there in 1819. St. Paul's journey began with the story of the conceptualization of the first Saint Church of that name. On September 14, 1822, a meeting was held at the Franklin Hotel to organize a Protestant Episcopal Church in Lynchburg. The Franklin Hotel was next door to present-day Schull's downtown. A subscription of $234 was raised to support a minister, the Reverend Amos Treadway, who preached to the congregation in the Masons Hall from 1822 to 1824. The Reverend Franklin Smith became rector in 1824 and continued to preach in the Masons Hall. The first Holy Communion service following the order of worship for the Protestant Episcopal Church was held on Christmas Eve, 1824. This is the front page of the record book, dated 1824, as well as the names of the original 7 communicants for that Christmas Eve service. The book these pages came from is 200 years old and is one of St. Paul's finest treasures. Finally, we have movement getting a church built. A subscription for a permanent building was raised in the amount of $2,804. The ladies of the church held a fair, the first in Lynchburg, to raise money for the new church. The funds were secured. The next step was to find a lot to build on. At some point, the corner lot on 3rd and 3rd Alley, belonging to John Lynch, had been acquired by Mrs. George Cabell, née Sarah Winston. Sarah Winston was the daughter of Judge Winston of the Anglican Church history. Mrs. Cabell donated that lot and $300 for the building of St. Paul's First Church. Hers was also the first funeral held at St. Paul's when she died in 1826. A fine brick building in the Gothic style, said to be very picturesque and surrounded by shade trees, was erected on the site. The church was said to be architecture typical of its day, but there are no sketches of what it looked like. Vestry notes from the time do describe the interior. The main entrance, reached by 18 steps, opened into the first floor Sunday school room and church offices. 2 flanking staircases led to the sanctuary. St. Paul's baptismal font was a gift from John D. Murrell to the church in 1826. It remained in the second church and was moved to its present location when the Clay Street Church was built in 1895. The most controversial event occurred with the installation of a pipe organ. The first in Lynchburg, it caused quite a stir and was mostly disapproved of by church members and Lynchburg citizens alike. Some felt the use of an organ in a church was sacrilegious and linked to pagan rites. St. Paul's was forward-thinking, as organs became synonymous with expected church trappings. This is a photo of an 1833 urban organ, which would most resemble the first organ at St. Paul's. The streets were renamed Church and 7th, and the building is currently occupied by Anthony's Salon and Spa. So that is the location of 1st and 2nd St. Paul's. If you look at Anthony's from the street, it is hard to imagine that there were 18 steps up to the front door. The lot was graded when the second church was built, making it much as we see today. The dimensions of the building are in keeping with the church's architecture. The interior walls retain several of the brick and stone walls that comprise the inner and outer wall of Second St. Paul's. Mr. Robinson took the greatest of care when remodeling the building for his business to keep what was left of the church intact. The shell of Second St. Paul's can be seen within the interior of the building. Several modifications to St. Paul's were added in the next decade. Churches were generally made of brick and stone and were most likely freezing in the winter. The addition of coal stoves in 1829 made the cold more bearable and perhaps kept parishioners more willing to stay in their seats for long sermons. The original building did not include a steeple, and in March of 1830, the vestry approved the addition of a steeple. Now, what goes with a steeple? A bell, of course, and perhaps a clock. These 2 items were missteps for the vestries at the time. A clock was purchased in 1835 for $400 for the use of the church. There was also a general feeling that there was a need for public notice of time, especially since most parishioners were late for services. After all the planning and expense to purchase and have the clock made, when it arrived in 1838 to be installed, it was found it didn't fit. The town council offered to take over the clock and have it fitted up and installed. The stipulation was that St. Paul's would surrender and give up to the council trusteeship of the clock and all rights, title, and interest in it. Lynchburg now owned St. Paul's clock. What happened next was an indication that neither the city nor St. Paul's was watching the clock. When the church was demolished in 1850 to build the second St. Paul's, the clock was taken down and stored on a hillside on 9th Street, where it remained for 5 years, out in the elements. When the new courthouse was being built at the top of 9th Street, some enterprising soul remembered seeing a clock discarded on the hillside. The city council took possession of it and placed it in the courthouse in 1851. It keeps time for Lynchburg to this day. St. Paul's bells have a bit of a torture story as well. In 1835, the Reverend Smith had ordered from some northern city a bell weighing 1,800 pounds at a cost of $450. The bell was installed and used in the first church after the tower was built. There is no record of what happened to that bell when the church was torn down to build St. Paul's No. 2. I wonder if they checked the 9th Street hillside. We do know another bell was purchased in 1855 and hung in the newly built tower of 2nd St. Paul's. When the decision was made to relocate the church in 1895 to the present Clay Street address, the church was built with no tower. So that bell lay dormant for a decade. It came to the attention of Mr. P.V.D. Conway, who purchased it in 1905 and gifted it to Randolph-Macon Women's College. Now located in the bell tower of the college, it is still in use today. The bell was nicknamed Conway after its benefactor. Present-day St. Paul's has no clock and no bell. I'm not sure they learned. The year 1846 marks the time when the necessity for a bigger church became apparent. The old church, while only 20 years old, was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. Those steps up to the entry of the church were on a fairly steep hillside. The steps needed to be repaired and altered to ease the difficulty of approach. St. Paul's is not a large building, and the topography of Lynchburg, with its hillsides, made it difficult to build any structure. More space was needed, so the lot on 7th Street behind the church was purchased for a vestry house in 1846. This building still exists and was used for Sunday school rooms until St. Paul's relocated to the Clay Street address in 1895. The former vestry house was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1997. A committee to investigate a new location was appointed by the vestry, but they came back empty-handed. The decision was made to repair the existing structure and give it a facelift. Another factor may have influenced the decision. When Mrs. Cabell donated the land for the church, there was a caveat in her will. If the time came when there was no longer a St. Paul's on the lot, the property would revert back to the heirs of John Lynch. The vestry was well aware of this, and due to constant frustration with funding, may have felt that free was a good thing. So, back to the facelift. Extensive and elaborate repairs and improvements were made by September 1848. Unfortunately, the number of pews needed to seat the growing congregation had been underestimated by 20. Although revenues and the congregation were greatly increased by the improvements, it was apparent that the church was still too small. In 1849, when the paint was barely dry from the updates to the church, the vestry resolved unanimously that a new and larger church be erected as soon as possible. As was discussed before, a new location was not sourced out, and the vestry decided to remain in place and enlarge the church as much as possible. This rebuild was fast-tracked. The last sermon was preached in the old church on April 12, 1850, and the walls started coming down the next day. The Masons Guild laid the cornerstone on June 11, 1850, and the cavity was filled with various periodicals of the church. When St. Paul's moved to the Clay Street and the building went through various business iterations, the cornerstone was never found. 9th Street hillside, anyone? The building continued with stained glass windows installed by year's end, and a new organ was purchased. The completion of the church was celebrated with the first service held on Easter Day of 1851. The Lynchburg Virginian ran an article on the ceremony with a detailed description of the church. Inspired by King's College Chapel, Cambridge, England, perpendicular Gothic was the style chosen. The exterior was stucco and tended to look like brownstone. The entrance had a broad central doorway into the first floor, with the second floor housing the side galleries and choir loft. The roof was open timber, stained a dark color, and the interior plastering was a sandstone color. A circular stained glass window above the chancel arch housed a white cross on a field of crimson. There are additional rooms in the basement for vestry meetings, Sunday school classes, and other church gatherings. So that's Antony's, where it is, and the 18 steps are gone. Can you imagine? And that ramp is still there. That's how you get down, come down 7th Street. And you can still see where the building, but those 18 steps, I just cannot imagine how difficult that would have been to manage. As with the first church, improvements were made quickly. Gas lighting was installed in 1852. Once again, a bell tower was not part of the design. In 1852, a committee was appointed to facilitate the addition of a tower. The tower was built and the new bell installed in 1855. St. Paul's almost lost that bell during the Civil War, when in 1862 it was offered by the vestry to the Confederate government to be molded into cannon if it was deemed necessary. Happily, the offer was never acted upon, or Conway would have ceased to exist. However, lead ornaments on the iron fence on one side of the church were cut off and molded into bullets. We won't devote much time to the Civil War except for anecdotes that are specific to St. Paul's. As the evening service on November 1863, it was noted there was no coal for lights or heat. During that winter, there was a series of robberies in Lynchburg, most likely due to the deprivations of the war. The police at the time were very diligent, and according to a vestry note, in an effort to catch a burglar one night, policemen saw a man walking in the snow with something in his arms. They apprehended him, and it turned out to be the Reverend Kinkle of St. Paul's with coal for a needy citizen. Shortly after the end of the Civil War, the Reverend Theodore Carson became rector of St. Paul's. It was during his tenure that the third and final St. Paul's would rise as an ecclesiastical fortress on the lot of 7th and Clay. And I give Al Chambers credit for that term, ecclesiastical fortress. I just thought it was so cool. Second St. Paul's was 20 years old by 1870 and showing signs of wear and tear. A remodel was done in 1870, 1871, with frescoes added to the walls, a new stained glass window, and updates to the roof spires and cross. The congregation had continued to grow, and in 1874, the vestry reported their opinion that a bigger church was expedient. The third St. Paul's was years in the making. Finally, in 1885, a committee was appointed to consult an architect. Several architects and their sketches were submitted to the vestry, but none were accepted. The vestry was still trying to decide whether to enlarge the second church again or move to a new location entirely. Remember, the lot the church was currently on had been donated. A new location would require purchase by the church. In 1886, the decision to move was made. Now, some behind-the-scenes activities were going on at this time. Captain Charles Blackford, a prominent Lynchburg citizen, Civil War veteran, and long-standing vestry member, was in charge of all things new church. In December 1886, he informed the vestry that a contract had been made with Mr. John Slaughter for his lot of ground on the corner of 7th and Clay Streets. This was a large, flat, 1-acre lot, most suitable for a building of the size envisioned for a new St. Paul's. Unfortunately, there was a beautiful home already on the lot that would need to be torn down. This was the Rucker House. This 21-room house had all the latest mechanical conveniences imaginable, to include a reservoir on top of the house to convey water, cold and hot, to every room in the house, as well as speaking tubes and bell wires for communication. All of the brick, windows, doors, mantels, joists, rafters, and many other essential parts would be saved to build a new rector's home for St. Paul's. More on that in a few minutes. So, a lot has been purchased. The vestry has pledged responsibility for the promissory note, and Mr. Slaughter was given a down payment. Sounds perfectly straightforward, right? There was just a matter of letting the parishioners in on the financial commitment made in their name. The vestry decided that the best way to convince the congregation was to issue an appeal. On Easter Day, 1887, Captain Blackford delivered a heartfelt address to St. Paul's parishioners. He cited that 40 years had passed since the second church had been built. The number of communicants had doubled, and yet the accommodation for them remained the same. Lynchburg was a very wealthy city by this time, with warehouses, factories, depots, banks, stores, and every variety of businesses in operation. There was also a bit of church pride involved as well. The Baptist and Methodist denominations had erected beautiful, large new churches on Court Street that soared into the skyline of Lynchburg. When all of the splendor surrounding it, no one wanted St. Paul's to come off as a pokey old church. Blackford's impassioned speech had the required result. The parishioners were much moved and embraced the idea of a new church. However, matters continued to move at a snail's pace. No deed had been issued because the church still owed Mr. Slaughter the $10,000 balance of the purchase price. In 1888, the vestry borrowed the money, paid the note off, and a deed was issued. Now let's build, right? No. Let's go back to the Slaughter home. The house had been raised in 1888 with the intention of using all of the wooden and brick building materials, both inside and out. Side of the home to build a new rectory. Unfortunately, this was not followed through on, and the house was torn down, leaving nothing with which to build a rectory. This receipt shows the sale of a few items from the house. In May of 1889, ground was finally broken. Funding seems to have been the nemesis that causing all the delays. A budget was drawn up, and an assessment on the congregation to pay for the church was mailed to the parishioners in the form of a circular letter containing a pledge card to raise the $5,900 needed to run the church. That's in addition to the cost of building the new church. So this was just to run salaries and just to run the church itself. So architects and proposals came and went, and frustration was mounting in regards to the building start date. It had been 2 years since Blackford's appeal. The former house removed and ground had been broken. Why the delay? The ladies of St. Paul's, always ready for a new project, were in a stagnant position, unable to move forward with the new church and unable to have any effect on the old one. Tired of waiting, the ladies penned a letter to the vestry in 1889. This letter is one of St. Paul's most important historical artifacts. It is handwritten in the exceptionally polite tone of the times, but does not conceal the thread of steely determination within. The letter implored the vestry to stop all the delays and to start building operation without delay. The ladies already had raised $6,000 in funding and informed the vestry that they would proceed with the next steps if the vestry didn't. The vestry's response to the letter was very gallant. Thanking the ladies for their zeal, the secretary, taking the notes of the vestry meeting, made some interesting doodles that had been preserved for over 100 years. So everybody, even back then, drew little boxes and things like that as they were listening to whatever was going on. So yeah, 100 years of doodles. The vestry was true to its word and contracted with the architect Frank Miles Day of Philadelphia to submit a sketch proposal for the new church. He was ultimately chosen to be the architect in 1891. Mr. Day's design was Romanesque revival with rounded arches and an overriding sense of massiveness and permanence. The exterior resembles a medieval fortress. The granite was sourced from southwestern Virginia and cut by 3 stone masons. It took 7 years to cut all the stones to complete the church. Church lore is that one man laid each stone and the work would be interrupted when money ran out and only resume when there was sufficient funding to pay for the next pieces of granite. Finally, on May 26, 1891, the cornerstone was laid in the rising wall of the new church. The ceremony for the laying of the stone took place 2 years after the ladies' letter to the vestry. Another 4 years would pass before the first service would be held. Frank Miles Day included a belfry in his design for the new church. As you can see in this photograph of the church, it was built without the tower. The theme of building all 3 St. Paul's with no bell tower is mystifying. Many of the answers to the questions raised concerning the building of 3rd St. Paul's were most likely in the vestry book for the years 1890 through 1900. Unfortunately, that book is missing from the archives and has never been found. Someone most likely took it for research purposes and didn't return it. It is a most frustrating loss. Let's move into the interior of the church. This is the original altar installed in St. Paul's in 1895. It is built in the tomb or casket style with 3 seraphim angels in the frontal, the Alpha and Omega anchor each end. The church interior is in the Romanesque design in the shape of a Latin cross. Frank Miles Day incorporated a bit of whimsy in his design of the ceiling. From seats in the congregation, the beams of the ceiling appear to be anchored with arch-like wooden supports. However, when the ceiling is viewed from the choir loft, the wooden supports are actually carved sea serpents, teeth, much like figureheads on the bows of ships. The use of sea serpents in ecclesiastical architecture can represent renewal, rebirth, and regeneration. St. Paul's stained glass windows are the crown jewels of the nave, chancel, and sanctuary. The Ascension window is an original composition designed by Frederick Lamb of J&R Lamb Studios, New York. The window is composed of opalescent glass, a new technique employed by late 19th century artists for coloring glass. The glass is a mixture of 2 or more colors and is translucent in appearance. Instead of applying paint on the surface of the glass, the artist painted within the glass, using layers to provide the shading that makes it glow. Something that makes St. Paul's window so unusual is that altars typically face east. The lot for St. Paul's would not accommodate this, so the altar with the Ascension window above faces west. The result is that while the window gets natural light all day, the magic of the setting sun on the stained glass gives off an unearthly radiance. 5 p.m. is the best hour to see this phenomenon. These windows are figures from the Old Testament and New Testament. All of these windows were gifted to the new St. Paul's in 1895 by the Sunday School. The tradition of renting out pews for revenue was a long-standing tradition in many churches. The rents helped defray costs of running the church. The first and second St. Paul's collected pew rents, but by the time the third St. Paul's was built, everyone was tired of paying to sit. This layout of pews from 1895 shows the names of pew holders, possibly because they had been paid for and therefore transferred to the new church. There were 3 free pews in front and 4 in the back. Funny thing about Episcopalians is their possessiveness about the pew they sit in. Yeah, right. If you want to know who someone is, you can find out by asking which pew they sit in. Most introductions are made, this is so-and-so, they sit in this pew. If someone were to accidentally sit in a taken pew, they might get a funny feeling. That funny feeling is the steely gaze of the pew's rightful occupant. The angel lectern was the gift to the new St. Paul's by the Guild of St. Agnes and the Ministering Children. This lectern was used in the first service held in St. Paul's in 1895. The pulpit was given to the glory of God and in memory of Theodore Carson, beloved rector of the parish. Reverend Carson was rector of St. Paul's from 1870 to 1902 and was the longest serving rector of St. Paul's. Remember, St. Paul's has a history of building its churches without bell towers. The belfry was added in 1912, but alas, no bell rings, right? Parish House Addition was built in 1912 at the same time as the belfry, using stone saved from the same quarry as the church. Can't be determined by looking at the additions that they weren't built along with the church in 1895. This is a photo of St. Paul's processional cross taken at the cross's dedication ceremony in 1921. There is a history with this cross as it was stolen in January of 1980 along with the gospel and altar crosses. Processional cross was found off Langhorne Road, cut up, charred, and burned. The processional cross, a second theft occurred on June 11th when the 2 sets of communion silver were stolen along with 8 collection plates. On August 13th, yet another theft. Taken a silver chalice and footed baptismal shell. Churches were not locked in those days. They were meant to be places of contemplation, and you could go in and they have sanctuary, whatever. So the doors were unlocked, but maybe after the first theft. The items stolen had more than monetary significance. They were memorial gifts to the church in 1895 to mark the celebration of the first service. The items were replaced due to the generosity of the congregation when at a silver gathering, parishioners donated any old sterling that was broken, damaged, disposed all chewed, or in any other way unusable. Enough silver was donated to make 2 sets of communion silver. Many of us have memories the sound of a sterling flatware paste makes when in a disposal. my family's was the pickle fork. The silver was melted, refined, and shipped to a company in Ohio for repurposing. The 2 sets were to be finished and returned to Lynchburg in time for the Christmas Eve service in 1982. Quite unbelievably, tragedy struck again. The shipment from Ohio was hijacked in transit and never received or found. Fortunately, there was enough of the original melted silver to make a replacement set, which we use today. The processional cross was remade into an exact duplicate of the original, using 10 pieces found on Langhorne Road. This photo of the chancel, taken in 1935, can be tied to a bit of levity from the time. This was in the April 1931 edition of the parish newsletter, and I quote, "One of the chief beauties of our services is the extent to which the worshipers in the pews are permitted and expected to participate in them. It is unfortunate indeed when the stranger sees in this participation just a lot of hopping up and down, as it is sometimes humorously expressed. We stand to praise, we kneel when we pray to him, and we sit when we listen to his word." The altar cross was replaced with a design by Richard Pumphrey of the Lynchburg College Arts Department. Mr. Pumphrey chose white bronze as a medium for his design because he felt it was richer, warmer, and had more depth than sterling silver. A stipulation of the purchase of the slaughter home in 1886 was that there was not to be a graveyard on the property. In 1987, St. Paul's began investigating the feasibility of a columbarium to inter parishioners who chose to be cremated. There was a usual pro and con faction, with one concerned citizen quoted as saying, "Since St. Paul's is nearly 100 years old and a historic landmark, there was great concern that the columbarium not be some tacky apartment complex for the dear departed." As you can see, the columbarium is a place of quiet contemplation that looks like it was original to the church when it was built. The large iron cross in the columbarium is a replica of the altar cross. Weighing close to 1,000 pounds, it is set on a plinth with a scatter garden of ashes surrounding it. The last part of the interior of St. Paul's we will discuss is the Chapel of the Holy Spirit. This little room to the right of the narthex was called a gable. Often gables are placeholders for a tower expansion at a later date, but St. Paul's already had a location for a belfry in its design. Its original use was probably as a cloakroom to house all the paraphernalia that came in with parishioners: coats, hats, umbrellas, walking sticks, and parasols were just some of the items members would have brought to church. A room that close to the nave would have allowed congregants to shed their extra articles and be free to enter the church unencumbered. The gable eventually became a chapel that underwent a refurbishment in 1996 with a new altar, dossal, and chairs. The windows were updated with Bonnie Proudfoot's design of stained glass inspired by Louis Comfort Tiffany's naturalistic windows. We could not get a good picture of the windows up above because the room is so small. You could only get a little bit. They tried a drone, but couldn't get much of that in there. So there is so much more detail about the history of St. Paul's that can't be included in this lecture time span. The ladies of St. Paul's have always been a vital source for the church and surrounding community. Our rectors have guided St. Paul's. Our music directors, choir, and organs have given St. Paul's the most glorious music from 1826 forward. The churches of St. Paul's have been continuous for 2 centuries. St. Paul's began its 3rd century in September of 2022 with bicentennial celebrations of luncheons, a banquet, the bicentennial book, and an art show. There is no doubt that St. Paul's will continue to be a vital part of Lynchburg's history for the next 100 years. Thank you. So, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, how do we obtain one of those books?
They're right here.
Okay,
They're 35.
thank you.
Any other questions?
What churches grew out of St. Paul's, other churches in Lynchburg?
I'm sorry.
Most of the time, old churches like other churches grow out of their church. What other churches grew out of St. Paul?
Oh, well, we had a couple of mission churches. There was Emmanuel that was in the Westover section of Lynchburg. And then there was one up on Diamond Hill. Grace Memorial grew out of St. Paul's. It was one of St. Paul's mission churches, was started in 1860, stopped building because of the war, and started back up. And then it eventually merged with St. Paul's and then moved to its location out on Ford Avenue. So that is the one that is remaining. Emmanuel was taken down, and the greenstone from the outside was put in the belfry at Grace Memorial on Ford Avenue. So you can see part of the original church still there. So, yeah.
Well, I take it that Court Street Methodist Church was built before the last St. Paul was built. Because you
Yes.
mentioned about the church and the reservoir there.
Yes, the reservoir, I'm not sure what year that was built, but the Court Street Methodist and Court Street Baptist were built before St. Paul's. That's the reason why, one of the reasons why they wanted to build new St. Paul's, because we're down here and they're up there, and you see their spires and all that stuff, and competition, and we didn't want to be this little down on the hill. So that was one, and of course then we ended up on the hill above the Methodist and the Baptist church, so that was even better.
So, wasn't there the Episcopal Church that's down there off Cabell Street, wasn't that an outbreak to St. Paul's as well?
It was, and I, for the life of me, cannot remember the name of it. The building is still there, and it's just I guess a derelict at this point. But if you go down Cabell Street, you can see. And then the Church of the Good Shepherd was not an outreach of St. Paul's, but it was when the Church of the Good Shepherd was closed. All of the communicants from there were invited to be a part of St. Paul's. So,
Where is the church of the Good Shepherd? Where is that?
it's gone. Yeah, it was torn down. Yeah. That was the African American church, Episcopal Church in Lynchburg. And then when it closed, they came to St. Paul's.
Where was it located?
I'm sorry, where was it located? The Church of the Good Shepherd? Do you know where it was? Does anybody know where it was? I'm not sure. I've seen pictures of it, but I don't know the street that it was on. So, anyway. Anything else? There was a lot that could have been in here. There was a lot of stuff from the paint choices, all of those things that could have been in the lecture, but there just wasn't enough time. Oh, yeah.
Well, as you just said, you can't fit everything in a 30 or 40 minute lecture, but I think it's interesting to point out that Rosalie Slaughter,
Yes.
who was a nationally and internationally famous physician,
Yes.
grew up on that site and then attended that church.
She did. She was, lived in the, I don't like saying slaughterhouse because that just sounds horrifying, so I call it the slaughter home. But yes, she was born there, and she and her family, lots of doctors in the family, and then she went on to become a physician. We have that dedication, one of those, the what? Yes, a historical marker opposite the church about her. She was gone by the time the lot was sold. Mm-hmm.
And another historically interesting fact is the Free Clinic of Central Virginia was conceived at St. Paul. It was birthed at Westminster Presbyterian.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was a beautiful church. That was gorgeous. It was ivy covered, and it was just a really beautiful downtown church, which we were very fortunate to still be a functioning urban church, because there's not many that are that old. And I know that the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church don't have quite as many people attending them as we do. Most of them go to what's the old Baptist Church on Bedford and Rivermont. That gets a lot of younger people and that kind of thing. So, we're always striving to add to our numbers as a downtown Episcopal church. So, yeah.
Is the church you mentioned on Campbell Street the one that you can see that's behind the library kind of?
No, I think as you go down Cabell, you can see it. It's on the left-hand side, from what I understand. And I think it still has something with a steeple on it, but it's abandoned and boarded up. And you would think somebody would, do something with it, but for the life of me, I can't remember what the name of it was. But yes.
It's pretty obvious when you go down the street which building it is.
It's white. Kind of, I don't know, it looks like it might have had a fire at some point, but it's still there. And then the Emmanuel was down, on the west over. And the lot for that is still there. It's on Marsh Street, where that particular chapel, it was a chapel. It was absolutely beautiful, and they tore it down because they didn't have enough people to attend. So, anything else? All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I hope that you enjoyed it. You learned something, and especially about 3 churches in 200 years. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue Ellen, and I know that she will be here for a little while. If you have any individual questions you'd like to ask, and again, she does have the copy of the book for sale. It was what, $35 a copy. She has several there. So thank you for coming.